I had a little bit of discomfort with what came back, and I actually felt that that was really good, because what it prompted me to think about was, what is the technology going to do that's going to be really helpful, supportive for the person? And I'm not sure that I got that empowering picture from the scenario.
My name is Simon Waller, and this is the Future with Friends podcast, a show where I make zero attempt to try and predict the future, even though I'm a trained futurist, and instead I enlist my friends to do it for me. Thankfully, I have some very smart and insightful friends. Some of them are best-selling authors. Most will be considered leading thinkers in their field of expertise. I guarantee that every single one of them will have compelling and unique insights to share about what might happen next. Each episode, I invite a friend onto the show to explore the future of anything that they would like. I then task them to go away and create a short scenario about that future set at least 5 years from now, something that captures their hopes and dreams, or maybe their fears and concerns. And then over the course of the show, we dissect that scenario. We start to think about the critical uncertainties, the alternate possibilities, and the decisions that we can make today to create the future that we want tomorrow. Welcome to The Future with Friends. In episode 2 of The Future with Friends, we are joined by a very good friend of mine, Dr. Adrian Medhurst. Adrian is a performance psychologist. He does a whole bunch of work around well-being and performance inside organizations. But today he has chosen to explore the theme of the future of work-life balance, partly influenced by his own challenges as a consultant, but also inspired by the work he does inside organizations. In this episode of The Future with Friends, we're going to start looking at how algorithms might choose to optimize our work over our life for us, and how we can maintain independence and agency in the face of technology trying to make big decisions for us. Welcome to The Future with Friends. Welcome to episode 2 of The Future with Friends, the podcast where we explore the future of whatever it is that my guest wants to talk about. And my guest today is a very dear friend, Dr. Adrian Medhurst. Adrian, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Simon. It's so good to be able to be part of this, honestly. Looking forward to it.
So, Adrian, I mean, you're one of my oldest friends in Melbourne. I think we probably met within about, I reckon, maybe a month of me arriving here, which was in somewhere around the middle of 2010. And I think we actually got introduced through, I actually think it might have been your old boss, Amantha, who had done some content that she was sharing at a group called the Creative Performance Exchange. I met some amazing people through CPX, and she was sharing some content around resilience. And when I spoke to her afterwards, she actually said, "Oh, this is not my content, this is Adrian's content. We should put you guys in touch." Do you remember that when we first met all those years ago?
I do, absolutely. I remember that it was about resilience content, and that being a topic that I've spent a lot of time on, given my doctoral thesis explored it. And I was just stoked that you wanted to nerd out on it, to be honest. I'd forgotten exactly where the connection came from, but it didn't matter, because as soon as we got together, away we went.
Yeah, I think we kind of penciled in like a half an hour get to know each other telephone conversation that went for like 3 hours. And that is a small drop in the ocean of nerding out that we have done since then. I probably do more nerding out with you than anyone else I know.
The same, obviously. And so that's where we'll keep ourselves in check today, won't we? We'll take our meanderings where they need to, and otherwise recognize that as much as it's serving us, let's also get to the important points.
Yeah. So I do think like this structure around kind of scenarios is a great way of kind of focusing people's nerding out. Like, it's like, how do we kind of gather information around the future and bring it together into a coherent story that other people can engage with? Because we do know that, human beings are both storytelling and story listening machines. So we're kind of tapping into something I think that's quite like primal and primitive around the way that we learn with each other. So it's kind of taking all that nerdy stuff, putting it into a story, and then using that story as a way of learning about what might happen and shaping the behaviors that we're going to undertake in the present. So we're in the right place, I believe.
Oh, I do too. And it was an interesting exercise, right? Because when we can nerd out, we can go in all sorts of directions. And because we're mates, we can kind of leave it there if we want to. Sometimes things are unresolved and that's okay. But I think even this is an exercise. It was interesting to say, let's put it down and let's kind of have it there in front of us and say, what do we choose to believe, what feels comfortable and uncomfortable is quite an interesting experience, really.
Yeah, so we're going to jump into that a little bit more later on the podcast. But before we get to that, we're going to get you to share your scenario. But before we get to that, we do have to give people a little bit of insight into the topic that you have chosen today. So share with us your chosen future to explore.
The future of work-life balance.
So the future of work-life balance. Now, I know from our nerd out conversations that your view of work-life balance may not be in how it's traditionally portrayed, which is the idea of a set of scales. And on one side of the scales, you have your work, and then the other side of your scales, you have your life. And it's about trying to find those two things to balance. That it's probably more nuanced than that. But obviously, work-life balance is the widely accepted terminology when we talk about this challenge of how do we actually take these important parts of our lives and bring them together into a whole. Do you want to share a little bit maybe about kind of what was front of mind for you? Why choose this topic of all topics?
Yeah, well, you're absolutely right that we know the term work-life balance, and I think lots of people would probably nod in agreement that most see it as an ideal that hasn't been realized for themselves. And I think some of that perhaps comes from the reality that it's not balanced. It's balancing. We're always kind of balancing with the ebbs and flows of the circumstances that shift in our work and life, either because certain things happen in our environment, there are changes afoot, or because we choose to follow opportunities and make some adjustments ourselves. And all of that is totally natural and okay. So I instead think that a term, work-life agility, and I use this a lot, puts us back in the driver's seat to recognize that it is about our agency in being very clear and intentional about what balance can look like based on how things shift, shifting to influence us or us choosing to make some changes. And so that's why I thought it was interesting to go work-life balance. Well, I think, and I explore something that I believe is more helpful, but if we forecast into the future, what does this look like for us as work and life changes, as technology influences that, and so on? Yeah.
The other thing about this, when we first chatted about it and we're talking about the topic, there's another aspect of this which I thought was also really interesting in terms of that motivation around this particular topic, which is that we both are kind of consultancy types. So we've given up on the kind of the corporate gig. We've gone out on our own. And I think some of the rationale behind that is often driven by a belief in kind of that work-life balance idea. And yet, paradoxically, when you first do it, you end up with way, way, way more time at work and probably less time with life. And you kind of are constantly pursuing this ideal that you set out to achieve. Has that also been part of the question for you in this?
Look, absolutely. But let's face it, Simon, I don't want to one-up you on this, but you're absolutely right in what you said. And then what I do for my work is on this very topic. So, I am living and experiencing and researching what this looks like, and I've been sort of very interested in it for a long time. But as a co-founder and director of Benny Button, we actually take this whole person view of work and life and looking at how our well-being and performance are interdependent across both of those domains, work and life. And so, I'm trying to do my best as a researcher and thought leader and trainer, consultant, all of those roles, to take what I've learned and to share that with others, whilst also acknowledging that in my own small business where I've got the work-life dynamics of running a small business and having 2 young kids and a beautiful wife and wanting to have a rich and full and meaningful life overall, it's not lost on me that there's some irony in the challenges that I too have with this very subject.
Well, I think that with this preamble, I think the audience now is suitably forewarned about the level of nerding out that could happen in the conversation, how meta things could get from here. But let's now switch into your scenario. What was the time frame, by the way, you chose to work with on this scenario? I did say at least 5 years into the future. What have you said has been the date? When is this
I've gone with
set?
a decade out, so 10 years. Yes.
So we're talking about the future of work-life balance in 2035. Yeah. Now I'm going to throw it over to you, Adrian. Lead us through your scenario.
Alrighty. I won't quite have the same voice tones as the amazing voice of Simon Waller, but let's see how I go. So, the future of work-life balance. Monday morning. My room fills with soft, sunrise-mimicking light as my biometric schedule optimizer gently nudges me awake. I don't feel like I've had the best sleep, and I squint at the balance index score that's flashing on my ceiling. Scores of 67. That's not great. The AI assistant chimes in, suggesting a lighter workload and an afternoon recovery block to recalibrate my energy levels. So, last week, I ignored the work-life algorithm's prompts to take restorative breaks, and now my balance compliance rating is dipping below standards. If it drops too low, I might risk being flagged as a high-strain worker, meaning that some mandatory intervention sessions with a corporate wellbeing advisor might be on my schedule. It's not that I mind the AI's nudges, it's better than burning out, but I do wonder if I'm managing my work-life balance or if it's managing me. So my workday starts in a mixed reality workspace where my avatar meets colleagues from 3 different continents. We each wear neural interface rings, like this, neural interface rings that monitor our cognitive load, automatically scheduling micro breaks when our focus wanes. The system logs optimal engagement metrics in real time, ensuring we stay productive without overexerting ourselves. It's eerily efficient. At lunch, my wellbeing compliance dashboard suggests I meet a colleague in a corporate-sponsored biopark, a green space designed to increase social interaction and reduce the stress response. The software tracks our conversation time and mood shifts, and if I'm flagged as too socially withdrawn, I'll get a little nudge to book a wellbeing-enhancing interaction. Basically, a recommended coffee catch-up. As the day winds down, I receive a balance forecast report. A predictive model analyzes my upcoming workload, sleep cycles, and emotional data to preemptively adjust my schedule. Tomorrow, it's recommending a 4-hour deep work sprint, followed by a mental detox session. I glance at the settings, tempted to override the AI and work late instead, but a warning flashes. Override detected. Continued manual interventions may impact your performance classification. So I hesitate. I used to think of work-life balance meant that I could have control over my time, and now I wonder if it's balance or just another metric to optimize. So I pause, and I make my choice. And just like that, just like my balance score, my autonomy starts slipping through my fingers.
Excellent. I think you read that beautifully, by the way. I don't think that I don't think you should be using me necessarily as your to assess yourself against. That was beautifully articulated, Adrian. Thank you for that. Let's talk a little bit about the process of creating this. So this is interesting because you're the first guest on the show who isn't a futurist by trade, doesn't have a background in creating these types of scenarios. Talk us through, I mean, I gave you some prompts and some ways you could use, say, generative AI to help with this, but maybe you could talk us through what was the process that you went through from here's this idea that I want to explore through to kind of having something like this, like as a finished scenario.
Yeah, so, and I could even say that I was so excited about what it is that you're doing with this podcast that initially I was trying to figure out what's the best topic to choose, and then I realized that it matters, but actually any topic that I connect with is incredibly fruitful for what was possible with this activity. So landed on work-life balance, even choosing to put it in a term that's currently used now instead of even trying to be more future-orientated based on how I'm trying to encourage progress from the outdated ideal of work-life balance into this work-life agility space. But picking that and then knowing that I have certain point of view, certain feelings, some of it research, some of it just my own experience. And then I did use the generative AI prompts as a way to kind of use it as a sounding board. And to be honest, that's what I tend to quite enjoy about using generative AI, rather than assuming that it's going to give me the answer, or the answer that I just take from first sort of prompt. I like to use it as a sounding board and to actually see through iterations where what the sort of back and forth is, what feels more right or less right. And as a result, you've got this agent that if I'm critical of where it went, I can kind of put it down a different track, and that's totally okay. So that sort of creative process, not saying the AI is creative necessarily, but the packaging,
your process,
yeah. So that's how it felt, and I'll hit the pause button there. So
yeah.
it was,
Can I ask, and I think that's interesting, and I've kind of used, I've got a kind of a love-hate relationship with it. I use it in a similar way that you do. I kind of still have some deep questions around the ethics and the legality of it. And so I'm kind of really important that I don't over-invest in it. I don't see it as being the solution to things. I feel it's an interesting technology for us to play around, especially as a sounding board.
Yep.
And having undertaken similar exercises, you sometimes, it throws up some interesting propositions that you may not have considered yourself. When you kind of went through this process, was there a couple of things that are in that last final scenario that you're like, that really struck a chord with me when it was first proposed or when it first came across your radar?
Yeah, well, it's actually a really interesting process, right? Because one of the things that I was conscious of was that I wanted this to be interesting for me, but I also wanted it to be something that we could dive into that, based on our conversation, would then be interesting for others. And so something I was conscious of was to not have the scenario paint a picture of a life that would be too difficult for someone to see themselves in. So you'll acknowledge that it sort of gets into more of the work dynamics side of it, and having my sort of balance in check through this technology. And I was really interested in where technology was going in this space, given my work is around what sorts of technologies might really support and enable people to be able to work on this sort of challenge in a way that is affordable, scalable, etc. when I'm not there, and so that was on my mind as well. And I think what was most interesting, if I sort of finalize this little trio of insights, was that I had a little bit of discomfort with what came back, and I actually felt that was really good, because what it prompted me to think about was, well, what is the technology going to do that's going to be really helpful, supportive for the person? And whilst that's really important, I also wanted technology to be empowering. And I'm not sure that I got that empowering picture back from the scenario. Instead, I got more of the technology is there to predict and fix and act in support, but not necessarily to amplify my own humanity and enable me to feel like I was making better choices about my work-life balance. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and we'll jump in a little bit more into the content. I just want to close out this little piece though, around the structure of it. And I think there's a really interesting couple of really interesting lessons is that when we do scenarios, we can do broad scenarios that touch on lot of topics, but they don't give us any answers because they lack the granularity required to actually really give us specific insights. So I think kind of what you've gone through is, yes, you've got a broad topic, which is work-life balance, but if you actually think about the content of that scenario, it's fairly narrow. A lot of it is around that, as you said, that use of technology in the space of work-life balance, and also obviously touched on the work you do with Benny Button around kind of performance and well-being. So I think that's really nice that you kind of naturally came to the conclusion for this to be useful for us, it also has to be relatively narrow. I want to talk a little bit about some of those choices. Like for me, this is very interesting in the fact that it is so dominated by the work side of things. It's all seen through the lens of the work side. And probably the term in it that is most jarring for me is this idea of work-life optimization. That it's no longer even about balance. It's actually about optimizing. And this feels like almost like the concept of work-life balance being co-opted by a tech company or by a big employer to kind of go, cool, right? So we now are seeing life as purely a way of optimizing how you turn up at work. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that must be an interesting kind of area to explore for you in your work as well.
Well, absolutely. And I do think that sort of sense or signal of things came through in the scenario. And that was one of those moments where I'm like, ooh, okay, in the way that technology is working here, it doesn't feel immediately, I don't feel immediately comfortable with it. And I do think that it sort of painted the future along this path of you're being taken care of by the technology, and it is in the service of optimizing efficiency or productivity. Yes, there were those nudges around, we don't want you to burn out and so on. And I do think that they are really important mechanisms as well. But optimization is kind of the idea. And what that means is it's not letting anything swing too far out of kilter because there are potential risks with that. And so on the one hand, you could say, yeah, well, workplaces would benefit from maintaining a level of sustainability and efficiency and productivity. They also would benefit from not having people going into risky territory in terms of overload or burnout risk or mental health disturbance and so on. So you can nod and say, yeah, they all make sense. But the question mark for me is, what are the choices around these potential imbalances or risks, and how is the person, the actor, encouraged to really feel clear on the choices that they make, rather than just feeling like there's going to be a little rap over the knuckles for it. Because I do think that some of the most important learning that we have is in being outside of our comfort zone, is in noticing when things don't quite feel right, and in fact from that being able to then course correct and learn from that and improve on that for ourselves into the future. And if technology can support that, I think that's really powerful. Rather than solving all of it for us ahead of time, can it kind of guide us along the way? And like a Sherpa doesn't climb the mountain for us. It can kind of see some directions, and it's got some tools to help you on your adventure. And I think that's a kind of metaphor that I like to connect with, and how technology might serve in that way. So that's sort of
there's
some
a couple of things I
meandering.
would like to pick up on that. So there's a couple of things that come up for me. So first of all, and I think this is probably relates to conversations that we've had around your own work. So you're deeply interested in well-being. You have been a yoga instructor. You've done meditation. You've been a high-performance athlete. You've done all this stuff, right? But I do believe that in that equation around well-being and performance is probably well-being that is more important to you than performance. Is that a fair enough thing to say?
Well, it is because, it's because of a huge life-changing event. And so this very much links to where we just were. When I was a professional athlete, it was all about pushing to perform, even if you were running the risk of injury, and that absolutely happened on a number of occasions. And I was a slow learner, you might say, as well. And so what I realized through some learning and some training and some practices, not only from a recovery point of view, but to make higher performance more sustainable, less subject to risk from injury, for my mental as well as my physical health. There were wellbeing practices that were fundamental to that. And I realized things that I might otherwise say, that's not going to give me the performance edge. I realized it was fundamental that I invested in those practices and sustained certain routines, not only to reduce the risk of injury, but to enable performance that I had otherwise not been able to reach.
Yeah.
So I think it is this full spectrum idea. It's not just risk and hazard support. It's also enabling, and maybe that's the thing that I'm sort of wrestling with here. I want it to be both. Have your back, and enable you to realize what's possible.
Yeah, and I think the challenge though is, and I know like part of what you do at the moment is like saying, hey, if we invest in people's well-being, the dividend we get is performance. And so therefore, as an organization, you should be generally interested in investing in people's well-being because of the dividend called performance that you get. But then as soon as you kind of then go, and therefore, company, we want you to buy this app and give it to your people to help them with their well-being so that you get performance. As soon as we kind of brought that commercial lens to it, you kind of then go, but who's now making the decisions about my well-being, and under what circumstances are they doing it? And what are the chances for that whole process to be co-opted? It sounds very good in principle, but you kind of go like, how many times, it's like follow the money. Who benefits from this whole system being co-opted? And it's like, well, the company benefits. What would it be like, for instance, like in that well-being and performance space, whereby I would maybe tell you in the short term that you're doing great and that you should definitely be putting a little bit extra in at work, even though I know in the back end it's showing that you're starting to burn out, but we've got these deliverables that have got to get out this next couple of weeks. We can give you a bit of a rest afterwards. And we're actually co-opting the system to deliver against corporate objectives as opposed to personal ones. And in this case, it's like, how much of someone's life are we willing to sacrifice so that we can get more out of the work piece? I think that kind of comes through in this as being almost like this underlying tension that we may have to deal with. People aren't willing to pay for these apps themselves. If we do, we get a freemium model where our data gets sold on through some data broker to in the dark web and all the rest of it. But if we're not willing to pay for it, who's going to pay for it?
Yeah. And it is a really interesting one, right, Simon? Because if there is that idea of the formula is we invest in well-being and we get this performance dividend, then it could signal a problem in terms of the motivation sitting behind it. Is this really in the best interest of the individual, or is this a performance driving intervention? So that's a question mark, and how it is legitimately linked to an organization's vision, purpose, mission, values, etc. How it's positioned with people, whether it feels really genuine that the organization and leaders and team respect this in support of both well-being and performance and work and life, a person having a balanced or rich life overall. But let's also remember that some of the points in the scenario kind of signal what can happen when people overwork themselves, when they are motivated to achieve meaningful outcomes at work. Maybe they've got some really great strength alignment and they've got some big challenging projects that they're working on, and it's so exciting that in the future we can now really invest ourselves in work that we find fulfilling. Well, people have tendencies to overexert themselves, to over-index, to push, to achieve, to perhaps progress in their career. And so even in the scenario, what's the driving force here? It's an interesting one. It calls that into
Yeah.
question a little
I
bit.
think that's interesting. So what I pick up in that is also we have these apps, and it's giving us, it takes a bunch of different measures and rolls them up into a score, and we use that score to assess our progress or how we're going. And as you said, like there is this kind of really challenging conversation even around understanding what work-life balance really means. I loved earlier on, you talked about the concept of balancing is a far more realistic way of looking at it than balance, that it's not a static system, it's constantly in motion. You've obviously introduced the concept of work-life agility, and in different fields, there's other takes on this as well, work-life integration and all the rest of it. But as a simple sense, you'd sign a code like there are intrinsic internal motivators that you would go, yes, this is my work, but I'm so deeply connected with it, it doesn't feel like just work. It feels like my life's work or something instead. How would an app like this measure such concepts? And probably can't. And so instead of measuring what really matters, it just measures something else, like heart rate, or like what are the things in the physical environment that it can draw on to generate a number. Yet often we don't kind of look at the intricacies of how that number is generated, and we start to put maybe more faith in it than it really deserves. I think that was something I picked up in this is we're almost asking people to outsource their own intuition about how they're going in life and this sense of balance that they've got. And rather than kind of be deeply reflective and go, how am I doing? What does that look like for me right now? We're just going, ask the app. It said 67. You're doing 67 at the moment. And it's like, how much trust should we put in it? What level of agency are we really experiencing when we use apps in this way?
And that's a really interesting one. And it's one where there is some existing research that sort of surfaces this conundrum. And I also wonder whether the future is actually going to help us to sort of put together our own formula, help us to actually think through what the formula would look like and what metrics will support that. But I'll give you one example. There was a study that looked at sleep, and it used sensor technology. People that were sleeping were measured in terms of the physiological side of their rest, how restorative their sleep was. But to manipulate things, they were asked how well they felt they slept. And then they were told what the quality of their sleep was. And it was actually either pretending that it was 2 hours better than it physiologically was, or pretending that it was 2 hours worse. And if people were believing the scores instead of believing how they felt about their rest, that was actually predicting what impacts that would have throughout their day. So I do think there's legitimate cause for questioning what sorts of metrics are we capturing, and what are the sorts of things that we are telling people, and are we telling them believe this, or are we encouraging them to take it as a data point, but to consider what this means and how they're feeling and how they're going to take that information? How is it empowering them to make choices instead of saying, this is you, follow the logic? You know what I mean? It's a really interesting one.
And now a word from our sponsors.
City life is a lot. Deadlines, noise, endless notifications. It's no wonder your stress levels are through the roof. But now, relief is just a subscription away. Welcome to Serenosphere, the corporate-backed biopark designed to calm your mind and reset your senses. Located in the heart of the busiest districts, Serenosphere offers a carefully curated green space, engineered for lowering stress, boosting focus, and improving social connection. No frisbees, no unpredictable crowds, just peace on demand. Use code Future with Friends for your first hour free. Serenosphere, because in a world that profits from your stress, now you can subscribe to peace.
I thought it was a lovely analogy about that. The app is like the Sherpa that helps you climb Everest. It doesn't climb it for you; it helps you do it. And on one hand, I go, "Oh, that's really lovely. I love the premise of that. It's there to assist you." That being said, most people also shouldn't be climbing Everest. like it's almost, where was the bit where you just walked up a hill? Where was the bit where you kind of just, you hiked in, I don't know, outside of Queenstown? Like, where's the steps, the baby steps to get before you try Everest? So I was
Yeah.
just trying to extend that analogy, and I was like, there is probably some stuff here, like there's almost a more rudimentary, like learning around work-life balance that we need to kind of instill within people before we ask them to climb Everest. If I was to extend that analogy for you like that, given your expertise in well-being and performance, what would this app ideally do? What would be those stages it might teach us before it says you're ready for Everest?
Yeah, well, what's interesting, I think it would need to capture certain data points over a period of time to understand an individual and their sort of typical ranges of things. Because that's important. Certainly with some physiological markers, just getting 1 point of data at one time and expecting that that's going to be representative of that individual most of the time. Well, that's not necessarily the case, right? So firstly, I think it would need to get a good understanding of the person over time. And then I think you're right. The baby steps would be, well, what are the little nudges and little shifts that we can encourage and see what impacts they have? Much like science doesn't want to throw too many manipulations into the mix at one point in time, because it then won't understand, well, we don't really know, with everything that we threw at it, we don't really know what had the impact. And what's interesting is that we might need a few different things in our formula. We might need a few different metrics. We might need a few different types of nudges in order for that to be the right mix, for that to be the right system for us. But how do we get there? How do we understand the individual broadly? How do we help the individual to gauge what the right metrics are and what their formula of what good looks like is to them, versus expecting that we figure it out in the labs and then we impose it on everyone?
Now, this that made me think, whether this scenario made me think about was, so my corporate experience was at Rio Tinto back in 2010, so 15 years ago, and I know some things have changed, probably some things haven't changed. One thing that really struck me was that when I was there, having meaningful conversations around sustainability was really difficult because people were inherently aware that digging holes in the ground is not something that's sustainable. And I've always thought that's okay. There's also the way that we operate. In the way that we operate, we can talk about being more sustainable, and effectively that's also often associated with resource reduction, which then associated with cost savings, and should be a conversation that we're willing to have. But a lot of people weren't willing to have that conversation because they're inherently aware of the other problem, right? I kind of think, and I don't know how this plays out, in the work you do with Benny Button, but I imagine that some organizations aren't too keen to talk about well-being because they're inherently aware that the nature of their workplace is one that well-being isn't necessarily front and foremost, and maybe therefore we don't want to talk about it too much. We don't bring this to people's attention. I kind of imagine in this scenario, there's also possibly some workplaces that are very shy away from investing in an app that talks about work-life balance because we seriously need people working 60 to 70 hours a week here. And
Yeah.
What do you see like that in what maybe is some of the unintended consequences or the way that this app or this future plays out where people are maybe a little bit surprised by what happens in it?
Well, and you're right that it might be a challenge in the future. It's certainly a challenge now, and it's not necessarily the case that an organization really knows what sorts of impacts are happening downstream in terms of people's experiences following certain work practices. However, that is changing right now. We've got new legislation that's coming through, and it's really encouraging. Well, it's requiring that organizations and their leaders are much more tuned into psychosocial hazards and risks, and getting a sense of what the impact is of work design, the work environment, the ways in which people work, and also how they interact with one another, for the potential impacts as it relates to elevating stress levels and the degree to which it might cause psychological harm, not just the physical health and safety that we are more aware of historically. So change is happening now, and I think it is an interesting time for organizations to wonder, well, with how work is designed at the moment and with the people that we have and how they work and how they're led and how they interact with one another, what does the quotient look like? Are we nervous about it? But what it brings up for me as well is the legislation is there. It's helping us to understand, well, what are the potential challenges or risks? What is the prevalence? And how might we need to understand that and then work to rectify that? What I'm hoping we continue to do and do more is to look at this full spectrum and ask, well, what does good look like? What does work design look like that really enables the individual to be at their best, to thrive, both the well-being and performance and the work-life balance? How do we design work like that? How do we lead individuals, and how do we set up teams so that they're interacting in ways that are really powerful at driving and supporting that? And how can we make sure that it is sustainable from a work whole of person perspective? I think that's what I get excited about here, right? Like, how can it not just be on that risk and hazard side and be on that, what does good look like here as well?
I think that's interesting. And I find, again, this is my opinion, I might be slightly dystopian, but I feel like that's overly optimistic, Adrian. I think that what happens is, like, we often don't see the system as being the problem. Like, quite rightly so. We look at it from the outside, and as outside people go, like, gosh, the way you've designed that system doesn't really work very well. But for the people inside the system, it's like a fish in water. It's just what we're in, right? I think there is often a tendency when the system is broken to blame the individuals in it as being incompetent or problematic, or rather than actually be able to acknowledge the system that exists. I do some work with local government. There's a lot of work at the moment. There's some new legislation that's come out around councillors needing to sign a code of conduct about how they're going to behave. Nothing's been done about the root cause of the bad behaviour, which is the frustration that councillors often experience inside the system that they're operating in, and the struggles to try and get things done, managing a diverse set of different stakeholders and viewpoints across a spectrum of diverse people, right? Like, nothing's been done to help train them up and support them in doing decision-making better. Instead, it's like the opposite. It's like, we will hold you personally accountable for the problems of the system. And I see that almost in this a little bit. It would be like, oh, if I was in a company, an organization, either like I need to redesign all of work, which that sounds like really hard, or I get this app, right? And now I can point out when people are struggling, but it almost makes the problem the person's problem as opposed to our collective problem. I think that's an interesting potential outcome of this.
Yeah, look, it is. And I get what you're saying, and what I'm hopeful of, and what I also believe is that it is a two-way street. You don't absolve the individual of some responsibility, some accountability, but it is the case that it can sometimes feel like the employee is given the resilience training teaspoon of cement as a kind of, well, we're going to give you skills so that you can handle this better, just to leave it at that. And that, I think, has historically been received poorly, because it is sending the message that managing the stresses of work is the person's responsibility. Let's give them the skills to do that, rather than thinking upstream, why is the work for some creating that level of stress? And if it's an unfair and unreasonable amount of stress, then what's our responsibility to adjust the way work is designed? And it's tricky, right? Because one person's stress might be another person's motivating challenge. And so this does get tricky. There's an area, and I'm actually heading over to Europe to speak on this tomorrow, but an area called job crafting. And I like to broaden it out to be the way in which we can craft our work and our life. But this is going to start to help us to see that there's the design of work, and there's also how an individual can feel and function. And there are methodologies for being in the middle of this top-down, bottom-up sort of two-way street. I'm mixing metaphors now, but to support the shaping and crafting of these little experiments. Yes, we've designed work top down. We've sort of put it upon an individual. And if it doesn't quite fit because we notice that there are things deviating and having an impact on the individual, rather than just saying, you need to solve this now so that you can fit the work, is there some sense of, well, how is the individual feeling and functioning? What is going to get the best out of them? And what in the middle might be some alterations and some experiments to see, with the metrics and with the levers that we can pull, what sorts of experiments might take us in some helpful directions. Yeah.
So this is obviously, this is not a prediction for the future. It's one of many possible futures that we could ultimately see come to be, right? And I kind of talk about these ideas, scenarios, and none of them are true, but they all contain elements of the truth because they're based on a series of signals or drivers that we're seeing around us at the moment, and we're asking about what might happen if they play out in particular ways. And I see with this, in this conversation, there's some really interesting kind of explorations to be had. As I said, it's just one of many possible futures that we could have. And I think in what you're touching on there is almost a slightly different one. You're actually talking about this idea of job crafting as being a much more, it's almost like seems like it's slightly less reliant on technology and an algorithm to determine what is good for us, but more kind of an active participation between individuals and perhaps leaders or bosses within the workplace to say, how do we do this collectively together? Talk us a bit more like, when we talk about this idea of job crafting becoming a future versus just your scenario you shared as being a future, what would be the shifts or the signals that would indicate we're going down one path or the other, do you think?
Yeah, well, and it's interesting. And I'm glad that you got a sense of that human-centered and collaborative nature of job crafting. And it's certainly the case that as a methodology, it can really support people and leaders to generate some ideas and some plans and to see how that works for them from an implementation or application perspective. That being said, right now I'm building some technology to try and support that. No, genuinely, there's a theory that helps us understand these competing forces, and there's some very academic measurement that looks at levels of balance and the flow-through impact from work design and the individual and how they function in teams, etc. Are they engaged? Are they experiencing stress and strain? What does the wellbeing performance outcomes look like? Well, with this model, we can actually look at some different indicators, and I've developed an instrument to support an individual to actually look at those key variables and get a bit of a read and a gauge for themselves so that it can signal back, well, here might be where certain things are mismatched or out of balance, and for that to support, I guess, to empower, well, what sort of crafting efforts might be valuable here. So to support that process, not necessarily to answer all of it for the individual, but to make some recommendations if they're getting out of balance and not noticing before they check in and track those competing forces and the influence they're having.
Yeah, I think this is such an interesting tension. I know it's something that we've talked about in the past in terms of Benny Button, that I think when you have obviously like Benny Button has two aspects to it. There's a lot of the work that you're involved in terms of around kind of the consulting side of performance and wellbeing. A lot of that's around kind of leadership engagement and kind of workshops. And then you've got a tech platform that you have been creating, which is there as a form of supporting it. But when we invest in tech, we have this perception of how well do we get to scale, and how do we get it to do the work that we would normally have done as human beings. It's almost like the value. Well, there's almost like two ways of creating value, I suppose. One way is we can create value by eliminating workers. So there was a person who did this job that tracked all this stuff. We don't have to pay that person anymore because we now have this app, right? Another version of value creation is by using this, we can actually create more value in the whole system. That if we use that information well, we can use it to support decision-making, and that decision-making makes us a better organization, right? I think you obviously deeply believe in the second version of that rather than the first version. Is that fair enough to say?
Well, look, absolutely, and it's because I'm concerned that we've been down a path that has perhaps been a bit blinkered, and it's not acknowledged that well-being ingredient in that sort of well-being and performance dynamic, and that it's also not necessarily really put the work and life, made that visible both for the individual but also for the organization. The workplace has tended to just say, I'm going to stay in my lane. The individual's life's none of my business. And whilst to a certain extent that's kind of true, what's the opportunity if the organization in a trustworthy way can say, look, I'm going to have an instrument that can help the individual to understand themselves more completely. Rather than having missingness in the data, I will be able to put together a package, and as a result, the individual can feel more informed. But if we can get some trustworthy de-identified data at the group level, we might also get an understanding of what people's work-to-life dynamics look like and see what comes up as interventions and supports that we wouldn't have otherwise thought of or thought were an opportunity for us if we just didn't even look at any of the variables on that side of the equation.
Yeah, I think that's often the case. I think especially in larger organizations, there are people whose job it is to provide that kind of support to people, whether it be, through HR or whether it be through professional development opportunities. And it's like, well, we've already got the resources. The question is only, can we use those resources better? Can they be a better support for people? And in some ways, I feel like with this scenario, it's almost like it kind of touches on almost a little bit of a cautionary tale, where it almost feels like there's an over-reliance on the technology being the entirety of the solution that has actually eliminated some of those roles that we would have normally have engaged to provide the final support, the human-to-human touch point.
Mm.
And then as a result of it, though, you're left with these kind of questions about at what point do I take back my own agency? At what point do I override the system? And am I willing to wear the consequences of that? Whereas it doesn't feel like that has to be the choice. It should be ultimately, how does the system encourage agency? How does it support you regardless of what decision you make? And I think that's a very different premise than kind of what I think we often see as these AI systems. I think one of the ones that I saw recently, which really struck me, there was a piece of software was used to kind of assess plagiarism and AI-generated writing amongst school children. And it proposed that in laboratory testing, it had like 95% accuracy. It's like you kind of reach this point whereby, though, that even if you're an experienced teacher, if you're an inexperienced teacher and you're like, well, would I be 95% accurate in terms of assessing plagiarism and AI generate? I probably wouldn't be. So I'll now forgo all of my agency and give it to the tech to tell me, even though 5% of the time it will be wrong, I'm willing to wear that 5% because otherwise I couldn't do better than that myself.
Mm.
What was ultimately found, though, in real world testing, it was nowhere near that level of efficacy. And also what we know about these systems, it also has these inherent biases in it. So if you had English as an additional language, the chance of it being detected as being plagiarized or AI generated was more than double or triple that of someone who has English as a first language. And so I think that sometimes with these systems, we put more faith in than we should. I love the idea that out of this system, it's like, well, what would we do to enhance the human interaction and I said, maximize agency,
Yeah. And look, that's my hope. And I think that's what came through in looking at this future and saying, yes, but this is a possibility, and there are other possibilities, as you pointed out. And I think that's something that I felt quite motivated by. I guess it's like, okay, well, I want to make sure that I'm pursuing what will ultimately help the individual to navigate and get insights from challenges, and to feel that they can make wise choices and they can learn from those choices rather than being controlled by the system as such. So that's. I don't know if we're getting to a point where we're kind of rounding out, but there was some really valuable, I guess, almost feeling like it was fuel in my crusade. If this is where the future could head, then how can I make sure that I'm working my butt off to enable people to be at their best? I mean, live well, have impacts on the t-shirt, mate. Like that's we want to encourage people, and the mission of the business is really an extension of something that I believe in so much. How do you really help people to live well and have the best impact that they can? And that's fulfillment in their work and life experience. And anyway, I'm sort of rambling on now, but
okay.
I think it's because I'm like, it's almost like a Jerry Maguire thing. I'm like, right, this is the future I want to create now. Who's coming with me? You know,
that's beautiful. Like, the reason why we undertake these exercises, apart from going onto a podcast called The Future in Friends and being forced to do it by the host, the other reason you might do it is exactly for the reasons that you're talking about. It allows us to explore in a little more depth some of the content that we come across on a regular basis. So all around you in your job, you will be coming across these signals of change, signals that indicate how the future might be different from today. And this is a process of asking you to take all those things and mold them into a story. But the story being set 10 years in the future, as I said, this is a process of exploration and contemplation with the objective that it might help us reshape or rethink what we're doing in the present. And so I suppose, and in addition to that, I think also there's a scenario that is something that you could even share with some of your own clients as well, to say, hey, here's a story about the future. It may not be a story that we all like. We might be a story that we all find a little bit jarring. And if that's the case, what would we do differently now to make sure that that's not the future that we get? So again, I think there's a really powerful use of this in that way. And I'd love to hear if that's something that you end up doing with it. But just to end with, though, like that first part of that around the exploration and the contemplation, you kind of touched on a little bit there already, but what do you, apart from, I think, that sense of reassurance, perhaps that you got about the direction that you're heading in, what else did you take away or learn from this that you think might shape or change the way that you approach what you're doing with either Benny Button or even in your own personal life?
Yeah, and I think I can't help but now bring it back to me. Because you're right. Like I went to configure this in a way that I'd hoped would sort of have people see the story and see themselves in it, and I didn't frame it in a way that people would say, oh, well, I can't relate to that. But I relate to it a lot, and for a lot of the reasons that we have touched on, which is, how is work organized? What are the controls that I need to sort of fit within? But also, what are my tendencies? And how do I need to keep myself in check? Running a small business and the irony of running the risk of work-life imbalance and so forth. And that's a reality, right? So I think what I take from it is not only knowing what future I'm really motivated to explore, what I want to create and what I want to avoid came through quite strong. But there's actually an immediacy of that. I want to take a look at what are the things that I'm letting dictate my work and life experience, and how can I ensure that I am practicing what I preach, stopping and checking in and saying, am I achieving, and I'm not going to say optimizing, but am I achieving a level of sort of outcome and fulfillment from the various things that I'm spending a lot of my time and energy pursuing, right? I've got a beautiful family. I live in a beautiful part of the world. I want to embrace and capitalize on that and be there for my life. And I also want to persevere on these important things in my work. And I want to ensure that I feel aware and empowered to notice any shifts that might be counterproductive on that overall work-life agility objective.
Well, I think we've done a fairly good job of keeping our nerd in check today.
Done.
Thank you so much for spending the time on the podcast. I know we get to have these conversations in private a lot. I think it's very cool to be able to do this in this way. And also, given the scenario and the conversation,
Honestly, dude, best of luck for your trip to Europe. I hope job crafting becomes the way of the future, because that feels like a really compelling scenario for us to pursue. Thanks so much for making your time, and we'll look forward to catch up again soon.
Thanks, Simon. Cheers.
Well, that is all for this week's episode of The Future with Friends. If you've enjoyed the episode and you want to support the show, the number one thing you can do is share it with your friends. In fact, it would give me no greater joy than to think in a small way the conversations I'm having with my friends could be a positive influence on the conversations that you are having with yours. Other ways to support the show include going onto the podcasting platform of your choice and giving us a rating. Obviously, I would like it to be 5 stars, but you should ultimately do whatever feels right for you. And if you don't feel quite ready for that yet, if we're not at that point in our relationship, the other thing you can do is send me small gifts in the mail. I always enjoy receiving them. Well, that is all for this week. We will be back in another couple of weeks with the next episode. And so until then, my friends, I look forward to seeing you again.